Welcome to the Brainbox podcast. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that brings the scholarship of the humanities disciplines to the general public. You can check out the other programs of Oklahoma Humanities at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll, a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities. Brainbox is a podcast for your noggin. It's meant to challenge our on-air guests to make the humanities relevant to today and challenge listeners to use their Brainbox to make better sense of current events. We'll talk to experts in humanities fields like history, philosophy, art history, literature, and ethics, who will give informed views on the deeper historical and cultural contexts of world events. We encourage you to comment about what you've heard by going to our website, okhumanities.org/brainbox. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the website, and you can also email us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. In this episode, we'll be talking about why the Victorian era matters in today's world. Oklahoma Humanities has sponsored a really great exhibition at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art called Victorian Radicals. And we're going to use some of the themes of that exhibition to talk about how the Victorian era is still relevant today. Our guests on this episode are Dr. Pam Bracken and Brian Chambers. Dr. Pam Bracken is a professor of English at Southern Nazarene University. She holds a PhD in English from the Catholic University of America, and her dissertation is focused on William Morris, who's one of the key figures explored in the Victorian Radicals exhibition. Pam has published several articles on William Morris, including a look at his political discourse and his connections with Iceland, and Pam has also edited a volume of William Morris's one work of drama, which is called Nupkins Awakened, or The Tables Turned, and that was published by Ohio University Press. Brian Chambers is the manager of tours and adult learning at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, and he has served in the museum's education department since 2009, where his responsibilities include exhibition interpretation through tour experiences and public programming, and visitor engagement through digital platforms. In addition to his work at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, Brian serves as the vice chair of the Oklahoma City Arts Commission. So welcome, Pam and Brian. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So the Victorian Radicals exhibition explores a group of young, rebellious British artists and designers and makers who revolutionized visual arts during the Victorian era in the second half of the 19th century. And the works of this era have continued to influence artists and designers and thinkers up to the present day. So first, I wanted to talk about how should we define the term, I'm using air quotes, the Victorian era, and kind of what were its major characteristics?
Well, I can kick in here from the woman's perspective. I think it's interesting that the not very beautiful Queen Victoria kind of put her mark on that era, so we wouldn't really have something called the Victorian era if we had not had a queen in England who would be a very kind of housewifey kind of queen. And she's not at all as sexy as the actress who's playing in a new series about Victoria on PBS. I think that particular series is making her a lot more of a radical woman than she really was. But I think that what marks that moment when she became queen as a relatively young woman, enough was changing in England at that time that her person, her womanhood might have had a bigger impact on issues than they did. But I'll let Brian kind of say how in the art history world, how you look at the Victorian era.
Well, across many disciplines of the arts, what emerged in the mid-19th century, in 1840s, 50s, and beyond, it was a reaction to many of the formulaic modes of expressing fine art. When I say fine art, I'm using air quotes now.
They work great on podcasts. I do it all the time.
Yeah. So it was standardized in all art disciplines. There was a formula, there was an approved aesthetic, there was only certain acceptable forms, and we see a dissolution of that around this time period when Queen Victoria takes the throne. It breathes new life into artistic identities, especially shaping the visual culture of Great Britain at that time when she assumes the throne. It's in many areas, many kingdoms, many countries, there was this sense of identity, being truly English, being one of her subjects that quickly shaped at that time. Another thing I would add is the first sense of globalism the empire and her many kingdoms or territories of the Commonwealth, they tried to export this version of their democratically elected monarchy in that form. They were very proud of that and tried to push it out to the rest of the empire. With that control and that power also came the influences of their exports, their goods, their tastes, anything from technology to an actual product that was made ended up on all corners of the globe. I said something else I'll add, and I'll do that again. To that point that they're exporting technology and goods, this also brings in the influence of what's happening within this exhibition, the objects on view. The 144 objects in this exhibition come from the city of Birmingham. At that time, it was a city that was emerging as an industrial center, a major industrial center, if not one of the first on the globe. Their exporting of goods and the technologies that they created made Birmingham one of the true industrial centers. One of their two biggest products that they exported, metalwork and glassworks, which is where you start in our exhibition. There's an image, there's a photograph from around 1948, and I forgot who the photographer was. Photography was a new invention, like all the other new technologies at that time, but it captures this beautiful scene in Birmingham, and it really sets the tone. It's layers of chimneys on top of factories, people moving around the city, and what happens in this exhibition, you see a snapshot of that image of England, of Birmingham at that time, and then how artists react to that. What's the catalyst for this newer movement that we'll see later on in the exhibition?
Mm-hmm. And I was also thinking that to some extent that idea of export-import, which is an important part of that global trade, was very much evident in the kind of interior designs that were a part of the world that Morris and the arts and crafts movement were set to change, is that kind of fussy interior with a lot of objects from the Raj from India were really very popular, so that you could see lots of photographs. You don't see it in the exhibit, unfortunately, but there certainly are some very interesting photographic images of things around Queen Victoria that look Indian. They look like they're from that South Asian, subcontinent, and it's a very influential style that kind of leads to some other theoretical issues that get kind of thorny, the Oriental issue. And
I definitely want to talk about that more later. Before we talk more specifically about the exhibit, I just have one question about the Victorian era that I've been dying to ask people who know about the Victorian era. I guess maybe a popular conception of it, or maybe my stereotype perception of the era, is that they were very prudish, and the image that I always think of is, and this is possibly a misconception, like table legs had to be covered with long tablecloths because even seeing a leg would be too provocative. So this image that we have, that maybe uneducated people like myself have of the Victorian era, do you think is that a misconception, or does that tell us something true about the era?
I think there was that on the surface, but it's the underbelly that's the most interesting. So the kind of work sociologists have done since that period give us a real heads up about the dark side of that prudery, is that you had high rates of prostitution, you had a fairly large pornographic industry. There were lots of places that you could go and see a lot more than a leg. So I think part of that is that it's two sides. There were two sides of a coin. The earnestness that we think of as Oscar Wilde would later make fun of this kind of Victorian earnestness in his famous play, The Importance of Being Earnest, which is a wonderful spoof on that. But I think that earnestness was real, and that led to this kind of Victorian mores that we think of that are part of the stereotype, but then there is always something true to a stereotype.
If you spend any time studying the biographies of the artists represented in the exhibition, they traded partners. Someone was someone's muse, and then later someone's wife.
Now we're getting into it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, definitely.
Brian, tell us a little bit more about the exhibit, kind of the wider themes that the exhibit explores.
Again, the exhibition starts out with setting the stage for a reaction. What is the catalyst that artists, makers, creators react to? And what we begin with in the exhibition is an industrialized Great Britain. Steam power manufacturing, factories that just churn out goods or products. It's invented in England at that time, very near Birmingham. One of the a few of the objects that you see are, well, rather, 3 large paintings, cut glass celery. It's a celery vase that has multiple purposes. It looks like a vase that you would buy to put flowers in, but it had a very specific purpose. The next room, you see a mass-produced rug. There are 2 rugs in the exhibition, one in the very end and the one in the beginning. One is handmade in the end, but you begin with the mass-produced one. Everything that we think about industrialization today and its challenges applied, if not more so in this time period in the Victorian era, because the dyes used for that rug just were dumped in the river or in the watershed. Individuals who had to work in the factory with the weaving of that rug were youth. There were no child labor laws. They had tiny hands, and it was the most effective to use in those machines. That also meant there could be injuries, and there was no way for any of those workers, especially the children, to find any recourse. So we are setting a tone with what industrialization looks like, what their cities and urban life look like. Actually, something I didn't mention in the very beginning of the exhibition, the first painting you see is this quaint pastoral scene of early Birmingham, untouched by industrialization. And within a few works of art, you know that's a Birmingham of the past. The next section speaks to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, or the PRB. In 1848, skipped a century, a group of students get together, 3 individuals who want to think about the response to Britain's modernization, which aka, i.e. means their industrialization. They're also reacting to the academic style of art. And what I mean by academic style of art is, again, that one way to do things. You go to the Royal Academy. There are many academies all over Europe that teach a certain technique. Usually you spend the first 2 years drawing, working on your drafting skills. Everything is light and shadow, whether that light is from the white of the paper, and you're only able to use one color. Maybe in your final year you can start using pigments, using liquid paint. And their form, how individuals, how the human figure looks, how the stage of that scene, that setting is set, is pretty consistent from the early Baroque on, with its sense of drama, what the visual arts should be, how they should look, and it gets pretty consistent all over Europe. And there's kind of this laundering of location, of region. It could look the same if it was produced on the Italian peninsula, or if it was produced from one of the academies in Paris, or an academy anywhere else in Europe. So I imagine the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood felt like they were operating with their own version of mass production and what the academies were cranking out. The next section we move on to, it's that second generation of Pre-Raphaelites.
Before you mention that, can we define the term Pre-Raphaelite? Because I'm always kind of, I've been confused about that term, but the exhibit totally helped me understand it. Where does that term come from?
They thought art was better before Raphael. So they wanted to latch on to what they thought art should be before the 4 high Renaissance artists entered the scene on the Italian peninsula.
What time period would that have been?
So the Quattrocento, or the 1400s on the Italian peninsula, what's produced, it's really, some label it the late medieval. Those who write about the PRB say it's a return, often it's a return to a more medieval style of creating visual art. Now, I spent a lot of time studying medieval art, and it's diverse, it's broad. So even that was an oversimplification of what medieval was.
And the PRB as a kind of cryptic acronym for what they did was kind of, it worked for a kind of cachet. It was kind of cool to go,
does
who
sound
were
cool.
who were the PRB? And on the back of the paintings, it would just say PRB.
Oh,
and,
wow.
And who were they tied up with? And this has got to be something that we need to look at. I think was part of the mystique that was
Sure.
produced around those initials. So.
And they had that layer of mystique, but right behind that, they had this great marketing campaign with their own newsletters, journals. An art critic, John Ruskin's working with them, and so they're getting their name out, their mission out. But there is something fun about that cryptic symbol.
Yeah.
It's a really elongated letter form of PRB with a few other lines. And perhaps we can share that somewhere. But
we
it's
can put it
easy
on our
to look
website.
up. Yeah. It was their stamp. It was their tag of their group. So yeah, anything before Raphael, they essentially thought Raphael took the truth out of art. One of the coordinating curators of the exhibition, Tim Berenger, said Raphael made things cute, and they didn't want it to be cute anymore because that wasn't truthful. That wasn't authentic. Moving back to the exhibition and its sections or main themes, then we move on to what happens with William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, and we tie a beautiful bow on it at the conclusion of the exhibition to see how later students and generations of artists continue with the themes and concepts that emerged from the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and that arts and crafts movement, the maker culture of that time.
One aspect of the exhibition that made me think about the way we operate in the modern world, in our current world, is how the pre-Raphaelites used, they were looking back at previous times, obviously, and painting images of the distant past, but they were using brand new technologies, and they were adapting to new technologies. Can you talk about how they did that, and what some of the new technologies they used were?
As far as materials, recipes to make pigment, to make paint is consistent. The methods to make canvases or stretchers are they're not quite ready-made, but they're accessible. So it's not an artist's guild or a studio 200 years ago where the recipe for that pigment may be very different from a guild a street away. So that's more standardized. These artists are also going outside, painting outdoors. I know we associate en plein air or painting outside with the Impressionists, but PRB artists are doing it 30, 40 years before.
And aren't there some issues, too, that I don't know as much since I'm not a fine art historian, but the idea that the canvases were of a different color with many of the PRB, is there some truth to that they were white instead of like a cream color? I had read that somewhere. That was intriguing.
So everything starts with a white ground. So it's more like what we think of buying a canvas today. When we go to an arts and crafts store, an art supply center, we pick up a ready-made canvas. More often than not, it has kind of a waxy feel to it, consistent white background. And so when student artists or artists of any ability start out, they have a white ground. But that started with the PRB. They wanted that white backing versus an untouched or unprimed canvas. Most of the process of starting your oil painting would be to build up layers so your oil paint is not spreading into the fibers like a stain. For PRB artists, they're starting with that white ground. That does a couple of things, not just the staining preventing that. It also gives you a starting point where you have light already on your canvas before you're adding pigment. So they're starting with this higher tonality. All the colors have a lot of white added into them. So if they want to create shadow and darkness, they have to add a lot of pigment to tone that down. But starting on white ground was kind of revolutionary because, and you can notice a shift in the exhibition from when they started using white ground to from before using white ground to using white ground, and the colors just have this pop, the saturation that just radiates off the canvas.
Weren't there new pigments, new colors even available to them?
There were new colors, safer colors. When I say safer, I mean they're stable. Just 100 years before that, there were pigments that were not stable. So something that was green, maybe the the yellow pigment mixed with that blue wasn't stable. So within 100 years, that green tree is now a blue tree because one of those pigments didn't have the shelf life. By this time, the ingredients for all of these pigments are standardized, and they have a practical life to them. They've learned from the mistakes of experimentation by artists previously.
Why do some people dislike the pre-Raphaelites? Pam, I've heard you talk just briefly about that, and I wanted to ask you more about why do people dislike them, their art? Or their philosophy, too.
Yeah, well, I think the person on the street and through a large part of the 20th century, I think, were interested in the new movements of modernism and postmodernism. And I think for a very long period of time, there was a kind of a feeling of estrangement from all of the profusion of detail and color when there's a lot of simplicity that was going on. And I'm oversimplifying, and I'm not the art historian, but there's this idea that you would see all of these symbolic things that are supposed to have significance to you, and all of the color and the motion. It was just too frumpy. There's just too much of it. And I worked a couple of summers at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and it was a lovely experience. And when I told them I'm working on the pre-Raphaelites, several of the people at the National Gallery of Art, kind of like the old Academy, the Royal Academy of London, were not enamored of my choice to work with some of even the literary people who were part of the PRB's wider circle. So it was not, and then this was, I'm talking about the 1980s. So, that was part of the sensibility, but you might know more when they became popular again. When they've been big now for at least 30 years, haven't they?
I would say around then, a new interest emerged, and it's culminated really with the wide reception of this exhibition in many ways. And now it's popular when 10 years ago we probably couldn't have hosted this exhibition and hoped to have enough admission to turn the lights on. Even with the great Oklahoma Humanities Council support.
Oh, thank you for that.
There's this new interest in it because of similarities, I think. Of course, with any avant-garde, anything new, there's a reaction to it, and it becomes the old guard. And we'll dive into this more over this podcast, but these were radical artists in their own time. They were addressing new subject matter, new content, breaking the rules of the rule makers, and soon after that, I would say, well, at least World War I and World War II, those interwar years, the invention of photography in the 1840s, all of that had great impacts on the visual arts. And I think the PRB, the arts and crafts movement even, and pretty much everything that was under the umbrella of Queen Victoria was part of an old world. After World War I and World War II, dramatic shifts changed our understanding of what art should be. And soon after this, especially in the interwar years, you see a shift in what art is. It doesn't have to be figurative. It doesn't have to be representational. It doesn't have to follow all of these rules of these centuries-old rules of how oil pigment goes onto the canvas. Where a figure can be, how you make that illusion of space. A lot of that's being thrown out for a variety of reasons, and from a variety of influences. And I think because that time happened, or that shift happened so quickly, that a lot of people forgot about PRB, but not for long.
Now the images, some of the beautiful models, the stunners, as they were called by the pre-Raphaelite painters, they grace greeting cards, and as much as that still has some kind of currency in our culture, is that hard print things, items that have the images of the pre-Raphaelites are everywhere. Bookmarks. You can still get William Morris hot mitts and all kinds of things that exist that are I have many at my own house. So I mean, just that the popularity of them has really not tapered off since I kind of started noticing in the 80s that of the last century that those things were on their way up.
Before I even knew who the PRB was, before I knew anything about this time period in art history, I remember my freshman year poster sale. The first of the year, they'd have the company come out and you flip through the big binders and pick up your posters for your dorm room. there were tons of PRB artists before I even knew anything about them or what was happening, what time period. I had no context for it. So in many ways, I think you're exactly right. It was not necessarily forgotten, but perhaps just overlooked.
What about that era speaks to us today, do you think? Why are people putting those things on their walls and decorating their houses with things from this era?
I don't know if there's one specific thing. I think Brian's alluded to some of and spoke directly to some of the specific issues of parallelism that we do see. Many of our concerns in a technological age were already underway with industrialization in the 19th century. I mean, that very long 19th century saw a very wide array of issues that were very difficult for the people living then. And I don't know whether there's just a kind of a fascination with still the lovely image of a beautiful woman, largely objectified, I guess you could say, by the person who's looking at that image. But I think there is something about profuse color that still does appeal to people.
Mm-hmm. It's dense with visual information. One of the things that was important for the PRB, set them apart, is their use of color, that great color saturation, the white ground we've mentioned, but also the density of visual information. Having as many details as possible. Things 20 years before, or again in that academic style, would have been edited out because it wasn't the focus, it wasn't the purpose. They took the time to focus on the details of the landscape, every blade of grass, the exact species of that flower or that tree squirrel or other animal in the background. The same amount of care paid to the background, the setting, as the human figures. And it truly, not just an emphasis in the composition, what receives the most attention, but the time it took the artist to do it. It was many of the paintings that you see when we start the PRB section of the exhibition. They're working in about about an inch square, a square inch a day. That much fine detail, overpainting, underlaying, with underlayers on that white ground. Many of the brushes only had 1 or 3 hairs on it. And so in some ways it was returning back to everyday subject matter, back to the landscapes, but in a new way, paying careful attention to the smallest little butterfly or insect being just as important as a human figure.
I was really interested in the exhibits, I guess the subject matter that they painted, and maybe you could say kind of what I don't know if it's accurate to say that they had nostalgia for previous eras, but maybe one of the themes I saw in the exhibit was that here they are in a time of advanced technologies, rapidly developing societies, mass industrialization. Were they looking back to a more simple time, and in a nostalgic way, or which was, I thought, weird because, not weird, but these radical guys were looking back on a simpler time. It made me think about how maybe in our own society we also hearken back to what we imagine was a simpler time, like maybe the 1950s. We think of it as a simpler time when it's not when it wasn't really. But is that true to say about this era, do you think?
Well, I do think one of the noteworthy things about the items in this exhibit, especially the paintings, are the narrative quality, that there is so much rich and, to use another word, dense over again, that the denseness of the allusion to other forms of storytelling, so that you've got, biblical stories. And even though the PRB are not known for their religiosity, and they were pretty much young atheists, but the whole idea that you have biblical allusion in stories. One of the, William Holman Hunt did have a Christian leaning and some kind of a Christian experience, and he did go to the Holy Land to paint paintings that would allow him to really be in that ambient space that these biblical figures would have lived in. But the compelling power of story, the Dante story, that Dante would have loved Beatrice and would have sought her throughout the streets, and that kind of way of a story resonating through time seemed of great interest to them. And I don't think that necessarily had to do with pure on nostalgia, but it was that they loved the power of a story, and that certainly reflected in the literature and in the paintings.
In music and literature and visual arts, there is this crafting of an identity I briefly mentioned earlier. For example, in music, Schubert and all of his volumes of Lieder, short little songs that he popped out really quickly, a lot of gumdrops, some masterpieces, but hundreds and hundreds of them. The lyrics used for much of that was newly crafted poetry, and also this this thought that this bringing back folklore, bringing back an oral tradition, and telling it in a new way. So this rediscovery of folklore, and again, crafting a unique identity based on regionalism. I'm careful not to use nationalism for many reasons. It's being used a lot right now, so disconnecting that from a contemporary context, crafting, again, a regional identity. That's the way, that was just one area of the subject matter. But also religious mythology, the contemporary practiced faith of that time, that's a wealth of narrative material. That's something people, whether they read a lot, are able to read, or highly educated, would have access to the same stories and narratives. So it made sense in the visual arts to continue to use them, oftentimes with a great twist. This looks like a scene you may be familiar with, but I'm including some things in this that will throw you off a little bit. You mentioned Hunt going to the Middle East and then Palestine, and particularly in Jerusalem. He was doing so to capture what his hope was to capture something authentic. How would this look in the time? And this particular subject is when Jesus goes back or is teaching in the temple. His parents lose him. They find him, and he says, "I'm doing my Father's work," or something like that. I forget the a close translation of what that narrative is about. He spent a lot of time, and this may be a time for us to start talking about Orientalizing tendencies. His purpose at that moment was to try to find something authentic. The problem therein is that he thought, and many of his contemporaries thought, and this is the problem with Orientalism, is that assumes that culture was static, unchanged, and has existed the same for that millennia. We, of course, know that's not true. And this happens all over the place in the visual arts. When I was taking my first art history course, there is still a huge section on Orientalizing tendencies in art.
Can you kind of define Orientalism?
Well, yes. Let me be blunt, actually.
I was gonna say there's a section in the exhibit book which is amazing that describes it basically as the casual racism. I'm using air quotes again. The casual racism of the way the pre-Raphaelites depicted other cultures.
To be clear, if we use that today in its same context, it would be offensive. And even looking back on the historiography and the use of that word, it's still offensive for our contemporary minds, because it refers to a Western mindset that is patronizing to cultures of the Middle East, Asia, North Africa, and it's oftentimes a fabricated view of what being Eastern, or in this case, Oriental versus Occidental West, what that means. So it's this distilling of what an Orientalizing aesthetic is through an Occidental or Western mindset. The problem is that means that Western mindset thinks it's superior, and it's also coming during a time of oppression, when other lands and parts of the globe are being used for their resources, cheap labor, and forced into inauthentic rule from some person clear across the globe. So my one hope for this section and this one part of the book, of the exhibition, with artists I've grown to love and respect, and except for this one little element, is that if they were part of contemporary understanding, probably a more global understanding today, that this would have been treated much differently.
And that's a difficulty, I think, with all of us who fall in love with the PRB, or in my case with Morris and his his set a little bit later, was that they could not be perfect. They can't fit up or fill the shoes of my sensibility about how they viewed women or how they looked at the world at all. But they were so far ahead of their contemporaries, if that's anything I'm giving them credit for, because I think that orientalizing tendency, as you say, is something that is so obvious when you look at some of the items and some of the paintings in this exhibit. And just to even have a frame of reference for what that orientalizing tendency is. I mean, that Edward Said is kind of the guru on defining that term and really elaborating on it, even in ways that has something to do with the way the Victorians looked at the world. I mean, he's even looked at parts of novels like Jane Eyre and novels like some of Jane Austen's work. Said has done a lot in the literary field and the theoretical end of my literary field to really engage us to be a critic of that Oriental.
And to recognize it in our own way of viewing the world.
Yes, yes, definitely, yes.
Back to that work that I mentioned, its title is The Finding of the Savior in the Temple. And through Hunt's travel and sketches, he found that no humans would pose for him, so he could do a figure drawing. So when he
humans when he was traveling
when
in
he was
the
traveling,
Holy Land?
they would not let him him sketch their figure. So for the individuals in this particular painting, and actually all of his paintings from this period, he recruited individuals who happened to be of Jewish descent in Birmingham. Huh. And so there are little features of that time period that you could see in this painting. Again, his hope was that it was authentically of the time when Jesus was walking the planet. But his goal, what he achieved was getting a great snapshot of what was happening in that place in the mid-1860s, or in the 1860s. There's another image that's even more problematic. Let's plug the exhibition and talk about all of its problems.
Maybe we can put some of these images on our website, too. It's hard to talk about art on a podcast, but we can have our listeners be able to refer to them, too.
I'm not doing a good job at formal analysis and painting a picture for our listeners, but this next one is slightly smaller and has two human figures in the foreground. One individual, he's a young man. The title of the work is Street Scene in Cairo. He is a lamp maker, and he stopped his lamp making, his job, because a young woman has walked down, and she's wearing a type of head covering that's only around her mouth and her nose. So not her forehead, not a full wrap. And he's feeling her face, and his right hand is on her left wrist, and his left hand is on her face because he can't see her face because of social norms. And in a Muslim society in Egypt at that time. So I think what Hunt, for another example of, I like the person, I think Hunt was trying to speak to the universality of love. We all love the same. The problem with this work is not only that beautiful, rather the problem with this work is in the background. There is an English nobleman with a top hat who was so tired of walking through these busy, crowded streets that he has a whip out and starts hitting people. So in this one scene, and we actually have one of the first sketches of this alleyway by Hunt, it doesn't include any of that narrative, any of those human figures. It's just of architecture. So I think there are fun narratives here, but also lots of problems that we're still dealing with today.
Do you think to some extent with that particular painting, because I did notice the figure in the background, which is one of the, was it Millet himself, not Hunt painting his friend Millet in the background?
Maybe. No, I'm not sure.
Okay, I thought that there was some mention that it was one of the
figure was modeled by Millet.
But
yes.
One of the PRB stood for that figure, and that it's a kind of critique then as well of the Imperial Project. I mean, it's as if kind of in that moment Hunt might have been speaking to something a little bit more than just what he was seeing as the universalizing of love.
Sure.
I did an air quote too.
I'm glad we've all done that.
Yay!
Can we talk a little bit about the role of women in the PRB movement, but in the Victorian era generally? Were women involved at all in the pre-Raphaelite B for Brotherhood?
by the time Morris and his set got involved, that kind of next generation PRB, the women were much more a part of the making, the crafting, the designing of clothing that they would wear than needlepoint. When Morris was full on into doing design work and interior design work, the women were very much involved. But I think it was slow going. From the mention of what kind of biography work we now know, we know a lot more about some of these men, particularly. And I don't always think that they understood women in ways that I would have liked. I think women were still very much objects to many of them, but Lizzie Siddall was the longtime mistress of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and he finally did marry her. And Lizzie's kind of been someone who's been taken from the margins and put back in the center with the work of women's studies and feminist theorizing. We're much more interested in the kind of work she did as an artist. So she did some of her own sketching and drawing, and yes, sometimes they look a lot like Dante Gabriel Rossetti's, but she really was trying to make her way. A simple woman. She was a milliner's daughter. She worked in a millinery shop. She had been discovered, and this story is kind of famous in the circles of the PRB, that she probably in a different era would have made her way in very significant ways that were not an option to her. So she died sadly of an overdose of laudanum, which was the very common kind of drug addiction in her day, and very sad. Interesting, but sad.
Well, we are fortunate to have many artists who happen to be women featured in the exhibition, but Pam's exactly right. That first generation, they were the muses who may have benefited from instruction. So the artist who they served as a muse may have mentored them in painting techniques, but it's not until that second generation that we see them really start to flourish. And unfortunately, that's just layers of societal history and the role of women in public and private life. I think it's another gross example of how that emerges in the recordings of our histories.
We have a few minutes left. I really want to talk about William Morris, who's one of the most fascinating parts of this exhibition and one of the most fascinating people of the Victorian era. Pam, I know are you a member of the William Morris Society?
Yes, I am.
Why?
I'm a long-time member, a 30-year member of the William Morris Society.
So why are people still passionate about William Morris?
He's so relevant, for lack of a term other than a gentleman who really was on his way to understanding. He's a proto-feminist. Many of my scholar friends in the William Morris set talk about him as very much of a proto-feminist. His characters in a lot of his medieval romances, he kind of did the corner on fantasy literature to some extent, and he really did see the role of women. He believed eventually that it would only be a socialist revolution that would make women be significant and important, and because that didn't happen in his lifetime, he at least saw the way through to that. He was an early environmentalist. He cared about the planet deeply. I think that's even reflected in a lot of the work he did with dyes and the kinds of things that he used to not contaminate the planet and the waterways in his very own part of England where he worked. So he covers every area. He is ironically a Renaissance man in that he was someone who did visual art. He did crafts. He wrote voraciously as a socialist reformer. He was a writer of amazing prose romances as well as poetry. And the days that he was, in his day, he was known largely as a Victorian poet. And so people reading those kinds of poems today are probably very few. Yeah. So I bring my copy, which cannot be seen on a podcast, of The Earthly Paradise, which was his long tome of a set of poems that were stories. And this particular work was the way he was known in his own day. And now very few people think of him as a writer. They think of him as a designer. They think of him as the leader of the arts and crafts movement.
His work was described by one art historian, I love this term, as a secular ministry.
Yeah, that's the name of that section where we start talking about William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just got super excited.
Oh yeah. Oh, he's such an exciting figure. I mean, he really is, and it was an amazing person. Yeah. This
time has flown by, but I think it's important for us to stress that again the parallelism between the things we're talking about, what individuals want to accomplish, people from all diverse backgrounds and lanes in life at that moment, had similar goals to what we're discussing today, with the arts and crafts movement and William Morris, the maker culture that we experience today. This is something that we've joked about, is knowing the source of everything we use, and also just the amount of stuff. When we started off that exhibition, if you were in an interior in the home of a Victorian house at that time, yes, the exterior shell is celebrated to this day, but the interior would have been dense with a lot of unnecessary decorative objects, tripping over everything.
Unnecessary is an editorial term there.
Yes, it is. Yes, that's telling my own aesthetic preferences. But the reaction to that, there's a fun Morris quote about nothing.
Have nothing in your house that is not both useful and beautiful.
There
That's
it
close.
is.
I think I might have miffed a little
Yeah.
there, but yes, that's it. Yes.
And the only other person that we have not talked about very much is John Ruskin.
Oh, what a fascinating guy.
Yeah. His influence on the PRB, on many people, it's like Morris. You see the beginnings, like the incubation of the Green Movement, definitely socialism, if not socialist democracy, and still embracing representative government, but getting rid of all of those hurdles that create us and them. It's exciting to read a lot of this primary content, this first person content that, again, it could come from today.
One thing that we have joked about a little bit is something maybe that people in our era have in common with the PRB or people of this era. If you go to a craft brewery, or if you prefer to go to a mom and pop restaurant instead of a chain restaurant, this is the level that I think about it on, Brian. After you mentioned this to me, that this is something that maybe some folks in Oklahoma City, in Oklahoma, have in common with the PRB. If we seek out handmade things rather than factory-produced items.
If you're doing your holiday shopping right now, are you stepping into a chain store, or are you looking for a small business that's locally owned?
Yeah.
And where do they source those items? It's incredibly comparable to everything we're discussing with this exhibition.
So before we go, I did want to just get both of your thoughts on why is it important and interesting for people now to study the Victorian era? What can we take from the Victorian era?
I think to some extent we can learn from some of their mistakes. If that's one of the best uses of history, is to make sure we don't repeat them. I think because the PRB are kind of like in what follows from that generation to the next. It's this like sort of little bubble of something changing and different in that larger Victorian era. But I think there is certainly much to be gained by looking at the art, the poetry, the items that were part of that reign of Queen Victoria. So I think there's something to that.
Yeah, I like the idea of learning from their mistakes. Yes, I love that. Studying the history of the 19th century, especially during the reign of Queen Victoria, helps add depth to our pile of solutions for today's problems. And the other thing is expanding the medium. Back to music one more time. The instruments of the orchestra are set. Like, they can't get any louder or softer. The piano that we have today, that's pretty much the range. We haven't grown past that, even after 150 plus years. There's something similar with the materials, rather the traditional materials used to make paintings. They're stabilized by that point. So the creativity, what's next, what's beyond, within that particular medium, they have to get really creative. It's not just, let's make the red brighter, the blue darker or more saturated, a black so black no light escapes it. So they're forced to find solutions and create something new, something relevant and interesting with the with the limited resources they had.
Well, thank you so much. This was such a great discussion. I wish we could go for another hour on this. I know you guys both might have some things to plug. Pam, did you want to mention a couple of projects that you're working on?
Yes, I'm excited to say that in the summer, for anyone who is interested in teaching William Morris, which I would always encourage on the level of a literary perspective on teaching Morris, there's a book coming out in June with a series of essays, and one of mine is an essay about teaching one of Morris's very well-known dramatic monologues called The Defense of Guinevere, and it's going to be a nice teaching pedagogic kind of oriented text that will be coming out in June 2019. And then my little university, Southern Nazarene University, is doing a very engaging event for Women's History Month with a presentation about 4 important African-American women who changed their worlds, and that's Zora Neale Hurston, Clementine Hunter, Fannie Mae Hamer, and finally Sojourner Truth. So that's going to happen in March the 12th at SNU, so look for more information about that coming in March the 12th.
Cool. We'll put some information about that on the podcast
That'd be
website
great.
too. And Brian, the exhibit goes through January 6th. We're going to post this podcast in early December.
Oh, fun.
But is there anything happening toward the end of this exhibit's run that people can take advantage
between
of?
early December and the closing of the exhibition, we'll have several events and programming. It's over the Christmas holiday season and other holidays. It's great. It's a great time to visit the museum. We'll have our monthly evening event, third Thursday. This third Thursday, which is December 20th, also references Victoria's reign, Victorian Yuletide. So in addition to many things throughout the entire building, we talk about the 4 things that Victoria and Albert really added to contemporary Christmas celebrations, between trimming a Christmas tree in your own home, making ornaments for your tree, having ornaments in general. That was practiced in Germany. That was Albert's tradition, and he brought it to the rest of Great Britain and therefore to the U.S. soon after. We'll also have we'll have a Santa Claus. We will have a Santa Claus at the museum. Another tradition that was added in Victoria and Albert's reign. The only thing I would add is that same night we have another special exhibition opening on our first floor gallery. It's objects from our permanent collection. It's titled Off the Wall, and it's a sculpture exhibition focusing on the past 100 years.
Oh, cool. Great. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate both of you guys coming out. And we encourage listeners to comment about what you've heard on the BrainBox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/BrainBox website, and on social media by using hashtag BrainBoxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios, where we record, at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Lauren Nixon. This program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. And this has been BrainBox, a podcast for your noggin.